Western Alaska is largely roadless, so there's really no need to get a driver's license. For areas where your state services are easily cut the soonest, whenever austerity measures have to be the solution to our state's budget issues. When we don't even have a DMV, how do you think those communities have that kind of access?
They don't.
They don't. But again, back to this 18-year-old who was registering, I gave her the form, and it's a one-page form, and it seems simple enough, but she looked at that like a deer in headlights.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is the director of the organization Get Out the Native Vote, Macuar Sparck. Get Out the Native Vote is a non-partisan effort in Alaska to mobilize Alaska Native and American Indian voters. Macuar Sparck is a member of the Qissunamiut Tribe of Chevak, but grew up in Bethel. After graduating from Bethel High, she moved to D.C. to attend American University. This enabled her to first work for Senator Ted Stevens' office and later Congressman Don Young's office. After her work in D.C., she returned to Alaska to work with tribes and subsistence activities with the Association of Village Council Presidents. She has been the director of strategic initiative at Get Out the Native Vote since 2020. Macuar Sparck, welcome to the podcast.
It's good to be here.
Where did you grow up and what was your childhood like?
Born in Anchorage, not because my parents wanted it that way. It's because I was a triplet. And we were a very precarious experience for our mother. And we were always putting her in labor, early labor and all that. So they ended up, the Indian Health Service or Alaska Native Services flew her in from Bethel to be on bed rest. And this is before prenatal care. This is before neonatal services and all that kind of good stuff, where we're still severely lacking in maternal fetal knowledge and expertise. But she was here in Anchorage for a long time, and we were still 6 weeks early.
Wow, that must have been so little.
We were tiny. We were about 3 pounds each. Jika and Amy developed pneumonia very quickly, and I was fine. But yeah, it was really touch and go for my sisters for a while. And we had just tender, loving care, just TLC. The nurses and the doctors just moved mountains to take care of us. And we were finally sent home in the spring of 73, and the rest is history.
Where'd you grow up?
In Bethel. My mom's from Chevak. We're from the Qissunamiut Tribe, and that's further northwest from Bethel. And
Hooper Bay region.
The Hooper Bay region, yes. The 3 villages near each other, Hooper Bay, Scammon Bay, and Chevak. And we're near the Qissunamiut Bay, which feeds into the Bering Sea. We grew up village. We had a village upbringing, and Bethel was great. Kuskokwim is very different from the Yukon and Bering Sea area. We had a really amazing childhood, and our father was from Baltimore, and he brought with him from the East Coast civil rights era mentality. So we grew up with our mother being an educator and our father being an advocate, nonprofit, grassroots type of person, and that really informed us in our growth.
Did you have a lot of interaction with Chevak? Or?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. When I say we grew up village, that's not Bethel. Bethel is
gotcha.
not village.
No, for sure.
Yeah. When I heard Maya's podcast with you, she was talking about how Kotzebue was just basically a bigger village, and Kotzebue is smaller than Bethel, and Bethel is very town. Like I said, the Kuskokwim is very different from the Bering Sea area, but there's a lot of relatability, but also there's nothing could beat that kind of childhood we had with subsistence. And a lot of people call it a lifestyle, but to me in the village, it's a way of life. Mm-hmm. And yes, it was a very informative childhood with customary and traditional values. And we also got to go downstates to visit my father's side of the family.
You go to Baltimore?
We'd go to Baltimore, yes, in Washington, D.C., and that was a completely different world. Already Bethel is completely different from Chevak, but then also add in
Baltimore,
the East
DC,
Coast. Yeah.
My limited understanding of Chevak, Hooper Bay, Scammon Bay is that when you look at it on the map, it's just like there's bodies of water everywhere. It's like beyond Swiss cheese. Like there's so much water. And I don't know if you have any comment about rising sea level and what that would do to that particular part of Alaska, but it just seems like that area is especially vulnerable.
Well, Chevak already had moved a couple times as a community before they settled on the High Bluff area of Chevak. And Scammon is on the water in Hooper Bay. They're on the water, but they're near some pretty good-sized hills. And our storms have definitely gotten different. And Typhoon Merbok was a once-in-a-century affair because we'd never heard of that kind of water hitting land the way it did and the devastation that it caused. And if you had superimposed someplace like New York City with what they experienced with Merbok, I think we got a lot of attention as it was, having a congressman from the area and a lot more resources devoted to an emergency response to that caliber of damage. But again, the devastation is hard to relate to when there's only like wooden structures or wooden sidewalks and things like that. But to have a government know that this was devastating to tundra area communities or coastal communities was really valuable.
Did you graduate from high school in Bethel?
Yes, class of 91. Anna Hoffman, Mary Sattler, Hugh Short, all kinds of really cool people.
All in the same
yes.
class. That's so interesting.
Yeah, Amy went to Boston University and Chika went to Washington University in St. Louis, and I went to American University in Washington, D.C.
It was like going to your dad's side of the family.
Yeah, I couldn't get into GW, but so I was not a legacy pick.
American University, Forrest Dunbar went there.
Yes.
Yeah, so I was say
we do have a small AU club here in Alaska, yes.
So what was college like? What did you study?
So I got an internship right out of high school with Senator Stevens' office. Amy got an internship with Senator Murkowski, Frank Murkowski's office back then. One of the gals we grew up with, Valerie Pengayak from Chevak, got an internship with Frank Murkowski's office too. Louis Beaver from Qissunamiut got an internship at Stevens' office. So we weren't the only natives there, but that was probably one of the highest quotient of natives serving in that summer internship program. So I was really lucky to be housed at American University. So I got to know the lay of the land on the campus and getting to Capitol Hill. And when Senator Stevens' office realized I was going to college there, they kept me on staff. So I worked through college, working for the senator's office as a staff assistant. And then after I graduated, I got a degree in international studies. And Congressman Young by then became chairman of the House Resources Committee. After a year of working in the Senate side as a college graduate, I moved over to the House side to work on the House Fisheries Subcommittee.
That's so beyond my experience. And I guess do you think it was because your dad had been like a political activist that you had grown up in like a political environment that was attractive to you?
We grew up in a political environment and it wasn't hot and sexy back then.
Right.
Non-governmental organization work was not lucrative. It wasn't splashed on every paper. It wasn't given a lot of attention. We were not given these internships because of Dad's favor with the delegation. The delegation had a very storied, like you said, with the bodies of water near Chevak. It was a very Swiss cheese relationship that Dad had as a thorn in their side because he was very anti-development.
I assume your dad was of a different political persuasion than Frank Murkowski, Don Young, and Ted Stevens.
1,000%. 1,000%. My dad actually got recruited by Senator Greening to move to Alaska to teach.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Greening was one of the two lone senators that voted against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which escalated American involvement in Vietnam. And my dad was a pacifist. And he crashed Senator Greening's office. And in those days, they did not have many constituents coming in to meet with them. And Greening, And Greening took a meeting with him, and I think they talked for hours. And then when Greening realized that Dad was a teacher, he said, essentially, go north, young man.
Yeah.
And so my dad in his early 20s moved out, flew out to Anchorage, and they gave him the assignment of Bethel. And my mom met him when she was teaching in Dillingham, kindergarten, I believe. And she was trying to get back to Chevak for the holidays, and she got withered in Bethel, and they met at a dance.
That's a great story.
Yeah.
I would love to hear any experiences from working for Senator Stevens or for Don Young.
Yeah, I was really mystified with the Senate. It was a very august body. It just seemed like there were adults everywhere. And the attitude was, let's get our nation's business done. And I joke now that I never thought I'd miss the days of leadership of Trent Lott or Bob Dole. And I am aging myself here talking about that. But it was the friendship between Senator Daniel Inouye from Hawaii and Senator Stevens, both World War II airmen. Both of them served their country and they served their states. And their bipartisan friendship was the stuff of legend, and it was really beautiful. And they worked so hard to get these last two states of the Union covered with the American promise. And I really appreciated that. It was very formative in my politics. I was very liberal, obviously growing up in a very liberal household, but I was working for Republicans my young adult life. And it was an adjustment to move over to the House side with Newt Gingrich as the House leader and to see that kind of culture shift, not just because the House is always very different from the Senate, because there's
403
times. Yeah, it's 4 times the size of the Senate. But it was to look at how party politics and party majorities treated the minority in every year was really fascinating and really sad. I don't subscribe to that kind of treatment or thinking because the pendulum always swings. So I think we should always treat each other decently and with honorable intentions to serve the state or the nation's business. So to watch that revolution under the Gingrich era was a little bit horrifying.
What happened after you left Congressman Young's office?
I got a little soul sick after seven years in Washington, D.C. Even though I got to come home, I thought, you know what, I need to go home. I want to marry this man I'm dating here in D.C., and I want to go home and see what home says to me first before I make that kind of commitment. So I moved home to work for the Association of Village Council Presidents, which is the YK Delta, the Bethel area's nonprofit social service organization. And I worked for them for almost 7 years too. I worked as a natural resources specialist. And so I got to work with all the marine mammal and land mammal and waterfowl management groups in the state. And I was doing crazy cool stuff, even though I wasn't a biologist. I was doing really cool tribal management with all kinds of groups in the state. I helped tag belugas up in Point Lay. I helped biologists who came in stinking from their cave den research. And we talked about Western brown bear management and the beluga issue in the Cook Inlet and the Bering Sea differences, the genetic differences between those two. Seals, birds, like I said, very cool stuff for a year. And my husband used to joke that I left him for another state. But I really was trying to see if I could find a Native husband because I really, really wanted to just be full-fledged back in Alaska again. And by then, I was aged out of that group. They were already spoken for, the men in my age group. So I ended up going back to my boyfriend at the time. And then Rob and I ended up getting married. And before he got laid off, we were living in D.C. or in the Northern Virginia area. But when he got laid off, he went back to New Jersey, where he's from. And I never thought I'd end up in New Jersey. I was like, wait a minute, I never signed up for New Jersey. All the jokes at American University was what exit do you live off from New Jersey Turnpike? We actually aren't really near a turnpike outside the Princeton area. It's a really beautiful part of the state, and that's why it's called the Garden State. And you wouldn't think that watching The Sopranos. So we were in a very nice part of New Jersey.
And what did y'all do in New Jersey?
My husband is in pharmaceuticals. The hotbed of pharmaceuticals is in Boston and in basically all of New Jersey. So he worked near Princeton on campus for a long time, and then he got to work from home as a mid-level manager with contractors for pharmaceutical companies.
And I guess it's pre-remote work time.
Yes.
But were you doing remote work before remote?
I was, yes. I got to work from home in Northern Virginia because AVCP realized, one, I had knowledge of the Beltway and working with the legislative branch of government, and that it was simpler for me to go to meetings and cover things than to fly someone $2,000 or $3,000 worth of a 12-hour commitment just to fly here. It made sense. So yes, you're right. I was remote before remote was a thing.
I guess to get us from there to get out the native vote.
We can fast forward.
Yeah.
I did work in the legislature for a hot minute. I worked for that District 38 office under Zach Fansler, and we had a really good team. And then Tiffany Zulkowski came in, and then I transitioned into doing contract work after that again. And I was raising kids too. So.
Hey, you know what? I want to pause really quick and talk about District 38.
Yeah.
Because I have had a couple of District 38 reps on the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
I had Ivan on, and of course, he was defeated by Mary Sadler. That was an interesting interview just because Ivan had caucused with Republicans, and Mary Sadler ran against him specifically about that she would not caucus with Republicans. And I don't know. I think like just in a more general sense, I don't know if you can talk about District 38 and its relationship to the Bush Caucus. And I interviewed Reggie Jewell. He wasn't District 38. He talked about how the Bush Caucus has not always stayed together.
Yes.
He talked about nowadays we think that the Bush Caucus has to go either with the majority or the minority. He said, no, there were plenty of times where half the Bush Caucus would be over here and half the Bush Caucus would be over there. And I don't know if you have any insight or things to say about the Bush Caucus staying together.
Of course, I have lots of thoughts on that. I have an amazing respect for the Bush Caucus. And to me, the Bush Caucus should always be larger than the 4 districts body. District 31 is delightfully a nice surprise for the Native community in having a Native representative represent a very mixed population district in Fairbanks.
Maxine Dibert.
So I want to claim her as a Bush Caucus member. District 36 should always, no offense to the road system in the interior, but District 36 should be a no-brainer.
I know that it's wanted to be part of the Bush Caucus.
Yes.
That would be Mike Cronk's old district.
Right.
Still waiting for ranked choice to play out, but probably Schwanke.
Probably. Yes, likely. And I work for a non-partisan voter education group, so I can't encourage people how to vote. We do not tell people who to vote for or how to vote on a proposition. All we can do is put the information out there and hope that people carry it and that people use trusted resources to make informed decisions for their representation. We're going to get a government whether or not we participate. And I had heard legend that we used to vote at near universal rates. And I remember challenging myself to confirm that. So I dug through the state records to look at precinct information. And early on in state history, and some of this is really difficult to read because they scanned PDFs of old records, and you can't Control F and find a community. And with redistricting every 10 years, it wasn't easy to just find that one precinct reliably in what district they were supposed to be in, because it changes every 10 years after the census. So it was a lot of hunting and pecking and just scanning very blurry old words to paint the picture of what the Native vote looks
what the
like.
participation level was.
Right. And in the early days, they did not put the number of registered voters versus how many people voted. So you can't get a sense of what the turnout was in the early days.
We didn't have universal voter registration with the DFD.
That wasn't even until 2015.
Exactly.
Yes,
so I mean, that's better than us thinking like nowadays we just assume all Alaskans are registered to vote. So we're constantly.
All Alaskans and then some.
Yeah.
Andrew. Which some members of the House are loudly criticizing, and I'd love to see what their thoughts are to cleaning up the voter rolls in that regard. But as it is, it's not disenfranchisement of the rural and native vote. But we'd love some help on that.
I guess for listeners, because we have automatic voter registration with the PFD
since 2015,
and because Alaska has always had churn of people moving here for a few years and then leaving, and I'll just say, as somebody who's lived in a lot of states and registered to vote in lots of states, I've never canceled my voter registration. I've always just moved to the next state and registered. So I think part of having over 100% registered voters is an artifact of folks who moved up here for a few years, collected the PFD, who knows if they voted or not. They became registered voters in Alaska, and then they moved to California or Texas or Florida or wherever, and they remained on our rolls. But I think it does look terrible. You just look at it and say we have 106 or 111% registered voters. That does not look right. I served on Judiciary Committee the last 2 years. We heard bills about this. I agree that we should do something to not have 111% registered voters. Like that, we should do something to fix that problem.
Having over 600,000 registered voters in the state that doesn't even have 750,000 people is really fascinating, I'm sure.
It is. So I agree that something needs to be done.
But when you talk about cleaning up voter rolls, that's where we're going to get a little bit defensive.
Right.
Because if they're going to cut down the duration of inactive voters and penalize us for not voting by taking us off the registry, that is very unfair to communities that are 100% reliant on the Postal Service to conduct polling and the return of ballots to be counted and processed in Juneau. And when communities, like 13 of them in 2022, participated in polling operations, but their votes were not fully counted, how do you determine whether or not those voters count as an active voter if their votes were thrown out or discounted? There's too much nuance for rural operations when it comes to elections for you to decide, you know what, you're an inactive voter, so we're going to take you off the rolls.
I hear what you're saying. And I also hear that there's a level of disenfranchisement about having to fill out I forget what the word is for the ballot. A question ballot.
Yes.
That there's a level of disenfranchisement just by being asked to do that.
Yes.
That the other people around you are not being asked to do. But what we were told by the Division of Elections is that by voting that question ballot, you are putting yourself back. You're reactivating your
Yes, even if your vote is arbitrated as null because you're not currently registered, the act of filling out that form does automatically register you for the next election.
Right.
But like you said, the very fact that you have to fill out a form, like I helped an 18-year-old from the Bristol Bay region register at their Bristol Bay Native Corporation annual meeting in Anchorage. So when I asked these young ladies who came up to our table, get out the Native Vote table, I said, are you registered to vote? Or do you have a plan to vote? And they both said that they weren't registered.
Because their parents have been doing their PFDs for them.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, exactly. So you are automatically registered to vote in Alaska, either through the PFD application or getting a state ID or a driver's license. And as we all know, Western Alaska is largely roadless. So there's really no need to get a driver's license unless you're participating in a boarding school program like with the Lower Yukon School District, where they fly into Anchorage for a couple months and they learn how to drive and they open bank accounts and this and that and whatever. But for areas where your state services are easily cut the soonest, whenever austerity measures have to be the solution to our state's budget issues. When we don't even have a DMV, you have to travel. You have to travel to Fairbanks. You have to travel to Anchorage in order to get access to a DMV or Juneau. How do you think those communities have that kind of access?
They don't.
They don't. But again, back to this 18-year-old who was registering, I gave her the form, and it's a one-page form, and it seems simple enough to anybody. But she looked at that like a deer in headlights.
Right.
She's like, I've never done this before.
And I also think about maybe just even the voter who went with their significant other or, their family and shows up and they want to vote, but then they're handed a form that no one else has to fill out. And they're like, you know what, I'll just wait.
Right. You're right.
You guys vote. I'm good.
It's a barrier.
Yeah.
And filling out this form. And she didn't know her social security number.
So I didn't learn my social security. I didn't know my social security number when I was 18.
Right. And that's fair. It's fair. But I said, is your family here? She goes, yes. I said, can you go find your mom and get the last 4 digits of your social security number so we can do this today because the deadline's tomorrow and I want to drop it off myself after you fill this out. And she did. To her credit, I was scared she was going to leave and just not come back, but she did come back. So that was a huge sigh of relief for me. And I thanked her profusely for sticking to it and filling out this form. And then I dropped it off and then she was in the system. But not everybody's comfortable with that. And a lot of people don't have that kind of vital statistic in their life. And the barriers to voting for rural Alaskans, especially Bush Caucus areas, is very real. And it's a privilege that a lot of road system people take for granted and enjoy. But for rural Alaska, just even getting an election workforce lined up is near impossible.
And I think we had in the primary this year, there were 2 precincts in far north.
In the primary, Anaktuvuk Pass, Wales, and Kaktovik
3
did not get to vote, except Anaktuvuk Pass finally got a volunteer and they had a half hour of voting on the primary in August. But Get Out the Native Vote didn't find out about that until 7 p.m. that day.
Wow.
And we're not very useful if we only have an hour's notice to salvage a community's ability to vote. And so thankfully someone stepped up in Anaktuvuk Pass. But for the people I was able to contact within minutes after 7 o'clock in Wales and Kaktovik, nobody wanted to step up. And I get it. And even for this general election, presidential election, I was talking people off a cliff because they did not want that responsibility of running a precinct in their community because they were overwhelmed with the checklist and all that formal statutes and rules. And you have someone volunteering out of the goodness of their heart, but they're not an administrator at heart. And they look at these hoops you have to jump through and these I's you have to dot and the T's you have to cross, not just in the election during that day, but the closeout process and the counting and phoning it into Nome and then packaging everything up and bringing it to the post office. That's where we lose a lot of volunteers.
Did you track Pelican getting miscounted and the report that 0 people voted for Mary Patola in Pelican? There was like this scandal where the votes were counted wrong in Pelican, which I think, has 40 registered voters. It's not very many.
That's the first I'm ever hearing of that. And again, this is where we really rely on the community to share these experiences because it needs to be documented. And we need to figure out what happened so that it doesn't happen again. Now, I want to talk about Ambler for a second because Ambler voted in the primary. I believe there were 27 voters, and their votes for Congress was recorded and phoned in, but not for the lower ballot races for House and Senate. And that really would have determined how District 40 was going to approach their general race if those had been recorded. And I was told by the Division of Elections, and again, this is one ballot. All 3 races were on one page. So it wasn't like the special primary and special election.
Where they could have missed a page or not reported
where they didn't turn it over.
In this case,
but this was one page, 3 races, and only 1 race was reported. And then the race was certified without those local races counted.
And Senator Don Nielsen was running unopposed. Really, we're talking about they weren't reporting.
Okay, we're talking about the House
Yes.
race, yes. Where you had a very competitive race among 3 people.
Yes.
And it was very frustrating to learn that, okay, the ballots didn't get back in time for them to be able to count the House race votes. And again, that could have determined entirely what the House District 40 was going to look like in November. But because of these kind of snafus that happen a lot from remote precincts, there's so little remedy.
The only reason we know about Pelican is because it was such a shocking result to look and see that an entire remote community had 0 votes for Mary Peltola. Alaska Public Media reported it on the radio, and Pelican heard the report.
We'd like to see the analysis on that.
Yeah.
And we got a call about one of the bush villages voting for a very off-brand presidential candidate, and another community voting for an entirely different off-brand candidate.
Right. Because I think they said that their votes went to Eric Hafner, the guy who was in prison, instead of to Mary Peltola.
I'm talking about president.
I'm saying that back to the Mary Peltola race.
Yes.
They reported that Pelican had this really high vote turnout for the guy in prison. That was just a misreport. They reported the wrong bubble. They counted the wrong bubble for the wrong person and then reported it out.
And so it's supposed to be cleaned up when the ballots get to location, right? And they can correct all those first night reports. And that's going to happen. Mistakes are going to happen. But it's alarming for a community to hear, you think we went that way when we didn't go that way?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's something else to conduct elections in a place like Alaska.
It's very unusual.
And states with high Native populations with reservation systems, because we do have a universality there. We are cousins when it comes to disenfranchisement and the way a Secretary of State or a Lieutenant Governor can treat these populations.
Can you talk about the history of Get Out the Native Vote, that organization?
Get Out the Native Vote has been around since 1999, and it was a labor of love among civic-minded volunteers. And we ended up getting really nice collateral. So we have these really awesome pins, very colorful pins that say, I'm a Nupak, I vote. I'm Yupik, I vote. I'm Sukpiak, I vote. So we have these collectible pins that people like to collect for their identity and proudly wear it during election seasons. And it was really nice to have an organization. Once upon a time, we had the Tundra Times. We had massive networks that, fresh off ANCSA and ANILCA legislation, that had huge carve-outs for the Native community and identity in Alaska, and statehood depended on it. Statehood depended on us being recognized and dealt with for some form of equity that the state constitution didn't allow for. The state constitution extinguished Aboriginal rights. So under Alaska's eyes forever and for now, they cannot look at Native people differently than they look at anyone from a road system. And a lot of people think, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with being colorblind? And people, whether with malintent or good intentions, don't realize how punitive that is. Just the very nature of that is so harmful to our First Peoples. And when we say First Peoples, or the real people, a lot of our names translate to things like that, the real people or the First People. It's not to discount other Alaskans. It's to say, we're here, we've been here for a millennia, and we're not asking for much. But we're also asking for the realization of the American promise, and we're asking for the promise of citizenship in this state. And either you get angry with us because of our modest asks or what we're due, and you say, well, if you don't like the new ways, give up all your petroleum-based products, or if you don't like the old ways, then move. When we move to urbanish suburban centers, they say, go back to where you came from. So there's not a huge harmony in the state. We're not going to pretend there is. But when people are hostile to rural life and rural villages for no real good reason other than that we don't want to hear about it. We don't want to hear about your troubles or your problems or your complaints, or the fact that a barge got caught in freeze-up delivering your fuel for the year, and now we got to air freight it out at 10 times the cost. We don't want to hear you bitching about that. It's not fair, and it's mean, and it's punitive, and it doesn't need to be this way. Alaska derives its wealth from our hinterlands, and that's where we are.
Hey, I've made this point on the record a million times. The idea that a random family from Kansas can fly into Anchorage and the mom can give birth on December 31st, and that baby is entitled to oil wealth from the North Slope the next year, and that people can with a straight face say that baby's entitled to oil wealth from the North Slope. It's just mind-boggling to me. It is mind-boggling to me. And that's a little digression. What I wanted to say is that I went to AFN this year, and I went to the subsistence debate the day before AFN started. And I confess, I was born and raised in Texas. I've lived in Anchorage for a long time, but not involved in politics. So these are all new issues for me. But I think that what I hear you talking about the state constitution and the problems of it, really, one of the good examples is with subsistence and the way we think about subsistence, because you hear it in the legislature all the time, that they want to make sure that white subsistence is included, that we're never leaving out white subsistence. And then we can never, just random families that move up and want to live off the land, that they have to be treated like an Alaskan native subsistence. And how can somebody not see that's different?
It's a place of privilege where people say, let's just follow the letter of the law and treat everyone equally without recognizing the generational abuse, theft, and mistreatment. We've only just reconciled with the government. Oh, it's not even a reconciliation, an acknowledgement of the harmful abuse of our boarding school system. My mother, in her generation, they were taken away from their families in the villages and sent to these secular boarding schools that were extremely countercultural, intentionally countercultural, and burning our native clothing and creating a uniformity among them, no matter what region they were from, and beating them for speaking their language. And they didn't understand, why am I being beaten? Why am I here? Why aren't I home doing what we've done for centuries? All this upheaval happened in my mother's generation, which I still can't wrap my mind around. And I grieve for the tumultuousness of that assimilation program. And it was brutal, it was cruel, and indifferent to the plights that it created and the social pathologies that it generated.
That we see today. I work on OCS legislation, and I hear other legislators talk about, we need to strengthen the family, and this is the fault of the lack of family. We destroyed the Alaska Native families with the boarding school system.
It's brutal, and it's, again, a stone's throw away from my life. Women were still being sterilized against their wishes because they wanted to prevent us from breeding. We had no say in that, or we were lied to about it. And our kids were being sent off to work for non-native families during their boarding school experience for free.
Reggie Jewell was.
Yes.
Reggie Jewell was. And he talks about it as a positive experience. But when you listen to him tell the story, I'm like, you were working for free for a white family.
Yes. And I'm glad for Reggie's experience. And my mother also says, I wasn't a victim of this. I really enjoyed boarding school. And I'm grateful that she was not a victim of that process. But a lot of her contemporaries weren't. And to hear Elsie Boudreau up in Nome expose and bring down the Jesuit order in Spokane, Washington, where they were living a very quiet and privileged life on Gonzaga campus, despite the horrors and abuses that they unleashed singularly on entire populations of girls and boys, is just extraordinary. And it took talking about it which was really hard to do for us to start exposing these terrible wounds that, again, that just the generation before me had experienced. I live a very privileged life. I got to go to school in my community, and I got to celebrate my identity. But it's so fresh. And generational trauma is a real thing. And to be dismissed or telling people that for us to get over it is really audacious, because look at the Redskins' name, right? Their brand and their name. They are telling nations of people to get over occupation and being conquered and colonized and stolen from. When they say, oh, but we've been around for 50 years. This is our inheritance. This is our identity. You want to take that away from us? And we're like, oh, that's cute. That's cute. Change your name. It's as simple as that. But it wasn't. It was not simple at all. It took an entirely different scandal that got the Redskins to change their name.
I want to talk about the work that Get Out the Native Vote.
We're losing track. Yeah. We lost track on the Bush Caucus, and we lost track of Get Out the Native Vote's history. Let me go back to the Bush Caucus really quickly and say the Bush Caucus was an incredible wellspring of really good policies. And again, this is when we were flush as a state with cash. But they came up with really ingenious programs to provide equity for rural areas in an oil-rich state.
And I learned about this very recently from Fran Ulmer on the podcast about the Molly Hooch decision, which basically required these schools. That court case came about at a time when all of a sudden we had enough money to build all these schools everywhere. And so it was good timing.
Yes.
However, we don't have as much money now, and these schools are falling into disrepair. And we've heard about schools like falling into rivers or getting close to it. And like, anyway, I digressed again.
How do you appropriate when you have nothing to appropriate?
And you have that same philosophy of why are we going to give that much money to a place that's serving 20 kids when we've got problems in Anchorage?
Yeah. We've definitely got a brain drain from our rural regions, and watching these communities shrink every decade after a census count is really painful, because it's scary, because there will be areas like former military bases in the Aleutians that are ghost towns now. And you see all that infrastructure and you're like, what do we do with this? One, we clean up the toxic sites for sure, but what do we do with all these resources out here and no population to be served by it? And that's a good question. It's a question for the ages, especially for Alaska. I think the strength in our state is our First Peoples, our tribal designation, our tribal identity, our Native corporation power and purse strings, and the services that our nonprofits provide to our people. We make this state richer than it actually is. And there's no reason why we can't be harmonious in these dual existences. But we have to be recognized in order to thrive. Now, pivoting to Get Out the Native Vote, 1999 sets the stage for when we started crafting a response to election cycles. And it was a labor of love, like I said, of volunteerism, because there was no budget for it. There was no one office to deal with it, but it went through some different variations every election cycle. And eventually the YANCSA Regional Association, which is the organization that covers all the 12 regional corporations, and they took it over and they used their really good communication system to distribute election information to their shareholders throughout the state. And then in 2020, the Cook Inlet Tribal Council decided that they were going to undertake Get Out the Native Vote. And even though it seems like, why would the Cook Inlet Tribal Council, which are 8 communities in the Kenai municipality of Anchorage area, care about a statewide voting program? It was a good place to house it. Let's say that.
Because everybody has to come to Anchorage for some
Everybody comes to Anchorage anyway. And a lot of South Central Foundation, ANTH, the Alaska Native Tribal Health Corporation, CIRI, and CITC have always been a catch-all for the state's First Peoples because a lot of us migrated here generations ago or just recently.
Or we're forced to be born here.
Although we are enrolled members of the Qissunamiut Tribe of Chevak. But I think I'm fascinated to see leadership in different regions because when I was a kid, I used to think the state teams, professional teams, were made up of homegrown people. But no, you trade among nations, you trade among states for the best talent to get the right team made up for you. And that's what Qissunamiut Tribal Council inherited, a lot of great people from different regions. And so it's fun to see, oh, he's Yupik. No, he's Sukbiak. Oh, he's Alutiiq. And just see how many different peoples are in a different tribal makeup. But the South Central area got an incredible base of people to work off of. So we bring a lot of talent to the table and a lot of different cultural values to the table. And Qissunamiut Tribal Council serves people from all over our state and down lower 48 tribes too. And also people of a income threshold.
Yeah.
Qissunamiut Tribal Council serves a lot of people. We have a big tent. And they decided to get out the native vote, and they created a different board for that. And they wrote a 5-year plan, and we're about 3 years into that 5-year plan. And I was hired 2 years ago, right when Mr. Young passed away. While I was preparing for 2 elections in a midterm year, we had to squeeze in the special primary and the special election on top of that. So it was 3, almost 4 statewide elections in a 6-month time frame, and it was insane. It was bonkers. 2022 was really crazy, but I got my sea legs under me under that experience, and it's really informing me as their first director to envision what Get Out the Native Vote can do for the state with over 600,000 registered voters, and we represent close to even 150,000 voters on paper. But when I set out to frame out why I had heard we used to vote at universal levels, that's when I started studying the voter rolls. And by the time I got to 1982, the hair on the back of my neck started raising because I was seeing Native precincts with numbers 70%, 80%, 97.5% voter turnout. And I was yelling because I would work late on weekends and holidays. And I was yelling to the empty floor, what is going on here? What happened in 1982? What was it? And it turned out it was a Reagan midterm. Jay Hammond had termed out and Bill Sheffield was running, and he wanted the Bush vote. So we had a very big, robust campaign for rural Alaska. It was the first year we got our PFD payout. So every man, woman, and child was $1,000 richer. And so if you had a family of 12,
it was a lot of money, $12,000.
Huge financial windfall. So a lot of boats, I'm sure, a lot of ATVs, a lot of snow-goes purchased that year, or construction materials could be barged out. And Proposition 7. There was a proposition to move the state capital, which is an evergreen kind of thing,
right,
from Juneau to Willow. And there was an abortion proposition, but I actually have not looked at those numbers yet for that year.
Hey, question. Does rural Alaska have a general opinion about whether the capital should be moved out of Juneau?
I think for us, Juneau is a spaceship right away. It's unreachable. It's inaccessible. You have administrators for very serious programs that are very good at going down to Juneau, and they have a budget for it, and they know how to talk to legislators. But for the average citizen, you might as well be on the moon. It's not accessible, it's not relatable, and we have no idea what it means. So to answer your question, We don't even know why it would be important to move it because we don't know what Juneau is. If that can help figure that out.
I did some reading of a couple of your op-eds that have appeared, one in 2022, one in 2024 in ADN, about Get Out the Native Vote. And one thing that it seems like that you've focused on is talking to high school seniors about the importance of registering, about making your voice heard. And I'm just offering this as part of when people get angry and say young people don't turn up to vote. I just always have to own this personally. I have a different experience than yours. I did not start paying attention to politics until I was in my 40s.
You're right. I was paying very much attention to it by 18, yes.
Yes, and I wasn't. And so I don't get angry about young people not voting because I didn't really vote. I did vote in a couple of presidential elections, but until I was 42 or 43, I had no idea who my state representative was or my state senator. It wasn't part of my vocabulary. I didn't even know what that meant.
That's fair. And I think that's a very American experience, is we don't have to know. Like I said earlier, we're going to have a government whether or not we participate in the selection process or not. And when we turn out and when the Bush vote is credited with a statewide win, it shows in the way that government administers programs and policies. Sheffield won by a pretty comfortable margin, and we got really good political appointments to decision-making bodies that affected our way of life. And the same thing happened with Knowles in the 1990s. He was credited a win through the Bush vote. And again, we experienced very good governance that way. Same thing with Bill Walker. Same thing with
Mary
Peltola. Obviously with Typhoon Merodach, I referenced earlier. Hickel's second term. Not his first term necessarily, but Hickel's second run at governor. We got a really good governance out of him looking at rural Alaska differently than he had before, even as Secretary of Interior under the Nixon administration. So participating at a level of 66% across the board in predominantly Alaska Native or ANCSA recognized precincts, 66% may not sound like a lot, but
it's a lot. I know that's a lot. That's way more than my district.
It's a lot. But for villages to have 97.5% voter turnout, like if one village had 3 more people voting, they would have been at 100%. Browerville had 103% voter turnout, because this is when you had to go through the rigors of registering to vote.
That's what I was going to say. It's the registered vote. So there's still probably people who aren't voting because they're not registered to vote. So you've still got the people who are maybe apathetic.
Yes. But it showed how driven people were to go through the pains of registering to vote.
Then they're going to vote.
And then going through voting. I think a lot of the drop off from the special primary in 2022, where we had to elect a congressman to serve out Congressman Young's last year of his term, people thought they were done. They were done. Oh, we had an election. It's over, right? No, guys. Three months later, we're going to have an election, a special election on top of the statewide primary. And you're seeing a lot of the same names again in both sides of the paper, of the ballot. And so voter education is saying, no, guys, that was just the start. Primaries are the regionals before you make it to state, right?
It's so confusing. And I think, hindsight's 2020. I'm not sure the original ballot measure 2 that gave us open primaries and ranked choice voting. I think what we see now is the most important part from my perspective is the open primary part, taking party control out of who the nominees are.
By nature of our far-flung communities in Alaska, it's a privilege to serve in a party.
Yeah.
And a lot of us don't have the bandwidth, the people skills, the
history,
the money or the history to fly in to conventions and work the party system, to get good at it, to become a favored personality in a party in order to consider who's going to run that the rest of us are going to vote on. So I agree with you. Open primaries was a huge game changer. We had 48 people on that ballot. which is not very fair for an average voter to come in and look at all these names and say,
Find the
what
right
do
bubble.
I do?
Yeah.
But we had 4 Alaska Natives running to serve out Congressman Young's term, and 2 of them were the top 5 vote getters, which is amazing. But if we were reflective of our true population, there should have been 11 Alaska Natives running for that same time. And that we're trying, Get Out the Native Vote is using a little bit of political science to drive the point home that we are a desirable constituency, we are powerful, and that when we vote, there is power to be wielded. Montana brags about a 6.5% voting base in their community. 6.5%. That's the valley. That's the Matsu Valley in Alaska. Here I thought, oh, we're only 7% in the valley. But I'm like, oh, no, we are 7% of the valley. And we need to start stepping up and aiming for a more perfect union and good representation in the valley, because a lot of those lawmakers don't understand why rural Alaska is important.
When you talked about 11, this should have been 11 Alaska Native candidates. I thought about it this morning. I've had almost 200 episodes of my podcast. And I thought, how many Alaska Native guests have I had? I think you're 16th or 17th, but there should be 40.
There you go. There you go.
So I've got like 23 to go. Yeah.
There's something we lost track of. The 18-year-olds you mentioned, I'm not talking to 18-year-olds. That's a benefit of our rural program. My goal, Get Out the Native Vote's goal, was to recruit an army of 16 and 17-year-olds to become election workers. Because the Division of Elections is budgeted for 6 people per precinct in Alaska. We have 401 precincts. 131 of them are entirely dependent on the post office. In our villages, I think the reason why we have dropped an average 30 to 50 points in voter turnout, one is maybe because of the 2015 automatic voter registration process, because when you're not going through the rigors of registering to vote, you're unaware that you are registered to vote. So you're not using that power because you don't even know you have it. But I think in the decades since 1982, we do not have a robust election workforce. And again, I talk about privilege a lot in this because you just have to realize that when you don't think about privilege, you are privileged. But when you don't have it, you have so many barriers and a lot more hoops to jump in order to become an empowered person. But in the road system, even for the Kenai tribes, the Cook Inlet Tribal Council tribes, you have dozens, if not hundreds of people to pick from. If you don't have enough volunteers, you can call someone.
And they can drive.
And you can guilt them into it, or you can impress upon their better good to say, can you please serve our community? And they'll answer that call. In the villages, I won't name the village, but I had to talk a volunteer off the ledge the Saturday before the Tuesday election because they didn't want to do it. They got scared. They got spooked. It's too much. I don't want to do it. I'm like, do yourself a favor. I know you were trained in February. Watch the online training again. Give yourself a better comfort level. But know this. You're afraid you're going to make a mistake and you're going to get in trouble. And granted, a lot of us do, even on the road system, even in Pelican. But as long as you aren't up to shenanigans and cooking the books, you're not going to be criminally responsible for the mistakes, right? And I'm not saying this to say that any of us are up to that. These are honest, good people who stepped up and answered a call, but then got intimidated or spooked by the responsibilities. And that's why a lot of our village workers flake out or disappear or ghost the division, is because they're overwhelmed with that responsibility for what's basically a 20-hour commitment and $25 pay per hour. And so I think when we have one person working a precinct, you're going to get this washout rate. You're going to have mistakes made. Can you imagine if we had
Well, it's so
6
much
people
pressure.
per precinct?
Oh, yeah, it would be life-changing.
So we're not getting enough adults to step up. So we thought, let's pivot and let's go to the youth. If 16 and 17-year-olds are eligible to work a precinct, at least that one volunteer is going to have some support. And we got 113 kids to sign up.
Wow.
As youth at the booth workers. Now, Region 4, where we need it the most, unfortunately, informed the Nana, when I had Nana Corporation call them to Region 4 to find out what was happening, because Region 4 wouldn't return my calls.
And just for our listeners, where's Region 4?
Region 4 is based out of Nome, and that's where 107 precincts from the Aleutian Islands all the way up along the coast to the Arctic.
Okay. Including Kotzebue and...
Yes. Yes. So that's 107 precincts in the most remote, rural
parts
of the state. It's the most challenging region.
It has
to
Savunga
manage.
and
Yes.
Gamble. Yeah.
It has all the islands in the
Islands,
Bering
yeah.
Sea, in the Arctic Ocean. It is a very challenging region under the Division of Elections. And then the regional manager at the time, supervisor at the time, said, "Oh, I'm not aware of any youth at the booth applicants." And I dropped my drink when they told me that. I said, I know it was a little overwhelming for them to see so many applicants for that one role for once. But to say there were none or they weren't aware of any applicants exposed a flaw in the system. So again, back to the precincts. If we were robustly staffed, of that up to 6 people per precinct, that village cannot deny an election is approaching.
And then that one person doesn't have all that pressure on their shoulders, that they have to be the one who doesn't make a mistake, that they have to be the one who opens and closes and reports. And it's just too much for one person, even if it's a small village without that many voters.
Yes, because there's a lot of paperwork. And that's not to say we aren't capable of it, but it is not a defining skill of our culture to do that kind of technical administrative work that is seasonal. And once upon a time, we had fisheries technicians on the Kuskokwim River. We got to do that kind of paperwork all the time because we were recording information. We were good at those kind of skills, but we have no more fish running there. So we don't have that kind of skill set among young people now that would feel confident answering the call to serve the community in an election capacity. Things have changed in my lifetime too. Forget what I even said about my mother's generation. In my generation, Mary Peltola's, Anna Huffman's, we have seen so much change in our time too.
In conclusion, if folks are listening to this and they like the mission of Get Out the Native Vote, is there a way for people to help?
Yeah, we're a nonprofit. We take donations. We've been reabsorbed under Qissunamiut Tribal Council. We were a separate arm, affiliate of CITC for a year in the time I've been here. And now we're back under CITC. So if you make a donation to Qissunamiut Tribal Council and designate Get Out the Native Votes program as the beneficiary of your donation, we'll get it. We'll get it.
Okay, I will put a link in the show notes for Qissunamiut Tribal Council for how to make a donation.
To get out the native vote.
Yes, to get out the native vote.
Right on.
Okay. Macuar Sparck, thank you so much for being on the show today.
This has been fun. It's a beautiful view from your Legislative Information Office window. This is my first time in this building for all my years working in politics. So this is pretty neat. Thank you.
Thank you.
I dropped a link to Get Out the Native Vote in the show notes. Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call 907-269-0123.